Okay, well, I think it's about time to start, but it also occurred to me that I sort of forgot to introduce myself last week, which was kind of strange, but I did. I see familiar faces, but there are some of you that are probably new to Brooksby. So just really quick background. My name is Frank Huntington. My wife Amanda and I live across town in Thorndike Gardens. I do have a PhD in history from Brown University. The job market was terrible when I got my degree, so I did the only sensible thing at that point. I went to law school. So I got another degree. Let's say I went to my 10-year college reunion, and I had been in graduate school for all 10 years. And some of my friends were amazed and envious, and some of them thought I was crazy. But in any event, my career was as a lawyer, but obviously there's a part of me that wishes I had been able to be a college professor. And now I have a captive audience, and here you are. So this is cool. So anyway, today is lecture 2 in a series that I wanted to do about answering the pressing question, is the United States an imperialistic power? And we certainly don't like to think of ourselves that way, but there are in some respects in which America has acted like an imperialist power. I talked a little bit about some of that last week. This week, today's talk is not going to be about that, because the way America shows up in World War I is very much the idealistic version of American foreign policy. The Americans can save the world, not the America conquers the world version. So we'll get to that. Okay, so there are today's topics. I want to talk about America and the First World War. To do that, I think we need some background on the First World War. So let's try to remind ourselves what Europe looked like in 1914. So there's the map. It's not quite the Europe that you would see on the map today. The biggest difference is that big red patch in the center. That is the Austria-Hungarian Empire. It ruled most of Central Europe and the Balkan region. There was a little country called Serbia, that's the little green island down toward below the red blot. And there was a smaller version of Romania. But basically, Central Europe was Austria-Hungary at the time. You may also notice there is nothing resembling Poland. Poland had been gobbled up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria 100 years earlier. So there was no Prussia. There was no Poland. The Ottoman Empire, the Turks ruled Turkey and a small portion of the European continent on the western side of the isthmus there, or the straits. And then, if you can see, France controlled northern Africa directly below the big blue patch. Italy controlled what is now Libya, and Great Britain controlled Egypt. So Europeans controlled the northern coast of the Mediterranean, and you can see the major countries of Europe on the map. Except for France, most of the countries on that map had a king or a queen, and thanks to these two people, virtually all those kings and queens were related. That is Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. They had 9 children. Those children had 42 grandchildren, and they all married each other. It's how it worked back then. And so, family resemblance, perhaps? The man on the left on that slide is Tsar Nicholas II. The man in the center is British King George V. The man on the right is Kaiser Wilhelm II. They are all grandsons of Queen Victoria, and they kind of look alike. Especially Nicholas and George on the left there. They're practically twins. And Nicholas, the Tsar of Russia, was married to Alexandra, who was a German princess that was Queen Victoria's favorite granddaughter. So Nicholas, a grandson, married Alexandra, a granddaughter. By the time you get to 1914, Europe, the major powers of Europe had divided themselves into 2 political alliances. You had Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy there in the center. They were allied with each other. You had Britain, France, and Russia allied with each other. And these were developed as defensive alliances. These are not ploys to try to figure out who they could conquer. It was rather, if somebody attacks you, I will come in and help defend you. So that was the theory behind the alliances. The most unstable of the European powers was Austria-Hungary, and I'll explain why in a second. The ruler of Austria-Hungary was Emperor Franz Joseph. That's him there on the left. He was 83 in 1914. He had been ruling Austria-Hungary since 1848. He ruled longer than I think he ended up ruling longer than Queen Victoria, who had a very long reign in England. So Franz Joseph is the ruler of Austria-Hungary. His heir was a nephew, Franz Ferdinand, and that's him on the right of the slide. Franz Ferdinand was 50. The thing that made Austria-Hungary inherently unstable was that it was one of the most ethnically diverse countries you can imagine. There's an ethnic map. As you can guess from the name and from the blotches on there, the Austrians in red and the Hungarians in bright green are the largest ethnic groups, and they're the ones that run the country, the way the political system was set up. But look at all these other ethnic groups that have some or no political power of their own. Running across the top, you've got the Czechs in blue, the Slovaks in a kind of orangey brown, the Poles in purple, and the Ukrainians in gold. Across the middle, you have a small cluster of Italians in the bright yellow, Slovenes, there's a little patch of them in kind of a dark pink, and then over to the east, you have the Romanians. They're kind of orange on that map. And then in the south, the folks that are all treated as yellow, the Croats, the Serbs, the Bosnians, the Slavic peoples of the Balkans. So this is a really complicated country, and a lot of those other ethnic groups wanted a greater role in how you ran Austria-Hungary. The official languages were German and Magyar, the Hungarian language. Each of those ethnic groups wanted more autonomy. They wanted schools conducted in their own languages. There was a lot of pressure for reform coming from the different ethnic groups. And stirring up trouble for Austria-Hungary was the independent country of Serbia. It's that little kind of darker pink patch there in the center of that map. The Serbs were their own little country, and they were doing their best to stir up independence movements within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, partly because there were Serbs living there that Serbia wanted to get their territory. Serbia wanted to grow at the expense of Austria-Hungary. Okay, so Austria-Hungary is a complicated mix with a lot of political pressures involving a number of ethnic groups. In June 1914, Franz Ferdinand, who I showed you a moment ago, he and his wife Sophie traveled to Sarajevo. And Sarajevo was the capital of Bosnia. Bosnia had been governed by the Ottoman Empire until 1908 when the Austro-Hungarians annexed it. So Bosnia is a little chunk of Austria-Hungary just to the west of Serbia. And you can see Sarajevo on the map if you've got really good eyes. Okay, so they're going on a goodwill tour to visit Sarajevo. And as you probably all know, Franz Ferdinand and his wife were shot and killed by a Bosnian assassin. His name was Gavrilo Princip. He was an ethnic Bosnian who was hoping to stir up trouble and liberate the Bosnians within the Austrian Empire. So there are some of the headlines, and it's interesting. After the assassination happened, opinion in Europe was somewhat divided about what's going to happen next. So if you look at the headlines, you've got one that says this tragedy may alter the politics of Europe. That's kind of neutral. Then you've got one that says getting rid of Franz Ferdinand will remove the danger of a European conflict. That sounds good. And then you got another one that says the assassination may lead to war. Initially, no one quite knew. What did actually happen is that within 6 weeks, all of Europe was at war. And the dominoes start falling. And I know this is a little bit tangent to talking about American involvement in the war, but I want to do it anyway because it's a cool story. Okay, so it didn't take the Austro-Hungarians very long to determine that Princip and his associates had been armed and trained by the Serbian government. It was which wanted to stir up trouble and thought assassinating Franz Ferdinand would be helpful to the Serbian cause. So the leaders of Austria-Hungary decide, well, Serbia's been a pain for a while. It is time to teach them a lesson. It's time to take care of our Serbian problem. So they checked with the Germans, who were their allies, and the Germans said, do what you need to do. We've got your back. And the Germans didn't worry about that because they assumed that Austria-Hungary would just teach Serbia a lesson. So it took a month before the Austrian government got organized enough, but a month later they sent an ultimatum to Serbia. As a quick tangent, at the time English language newspapers used the word Servia with a V instead of Serbia with a B that we use today, so that's why the headlines look a little different. In any event, so what did Austria do? They demanded that the Serbian government shut down any organization within Serbia that was trying to stir up trouble for Austria. And they also demanded that the Austrian officials participate in the investigation in Serbia and help identify and arrest members of the Serbian government who were part of the conspiracy. So they want to get in there and take charge of the investigation. Not for a minute did the Austrians expect Serbia to say yes to that ultimatum. And so as soon as they sent it, they started mobilizing their troops, and there are some of them lined up on the slide. The Serbs were really clever. They responded to the ultimatum agreeing to almost everything. And they did it with such a nice touch that the Austrian foreign minister said that Serbia's response was the most brilliant example of diplomatic skill he had ever seen. But the Serbs couldn't agree to that last point, which would have been allowing Austria to participate in the investigation and the arrest and the trial of members of the Serbian government. They couldn't agree to that. So, Austria declares war. That's the actual telegram. On the slide there is the telegram they sent declaring war. There were some of the soldiers smiling, getting ready to go fight Serbia. And at this point, what happened could have been a very simple thing. Austria-Hungary sends its troops into Serbia, teaches them a lesson, conquers Serbia, or at least installs a new government that won't be quite as much of a problem. It could have been simple and quick, but it wasn't. And the problem is, and let's look at our map, Russia, at this point, the Russian Empire, Tsar Nicholas II, considered themselves the protectors of the Slavic peoples, and the Serbs were among the Slavic groups in Europe. Russia felt they wanted to back up the Serbs and protect them from the aggression of the Austrians. So when Austria attacked Serbia, the Russians started to mobilize their army so that they could go help the Serbs. Mobilization was a big deal. If you think about this, the Russians had several million men in the army. Russia's a big country. To get their troops to the front required a lot of planning, a lot of railroad cars to put people on, a lot of scheduling to try to figure out how to get everybody to the front. Once you start mobilizing, you have to really go through with it. And so once the Russians started mobilizing, that turned everyone's attention to Germany. What's Germany going to do? Because here's the problem. Because of the alliance system, the Russians never for a minute thought they'd only have to fight Austria in a war. Their military geniuses, their only plan for mobilizing was to go after both Austria and Germany. So they're starting to mobilize their army, and their army is starting to head toward the German border. That's a problem if you're Germany. So Germany gave an ultimatum back to Russia. Stop mobilizing or we're going to have to do something. They didn't, so Germany declared war on Russia. Now that could have been limited too. You could have just had Germany and Austria taking on Russia, but that didn't happen either. Remember the alliance system. Suppose you're Germany. You're trying to figure out what happens if we ever actually get in a war. What do? You look at that map, they never thought for a minute that they'd only be fighting Russia. They assumed they'd also be fighting France. And so if you're Germany, you're facing the prospect of fighting on two fronts at once. What do? Well, I'll back up for a second. Remember, Russia's really big. The Germans calculated it would take 6 weeks before the Russians could get their army up to the front. So that General Alfred von Schlieffen of the German army came up with a plan. If we're going to fight a two-front war, what we have to do is knock France out so fast that we can defeat France before the Russians even get organized. So he developed that plan where the German army is going to come marching into France really fast and knock it out. And what you'll notice, though, is rather than going and invading France across the border with France, they figured, well, that's where the French army is, defending their border. We might as well go through Belgium, because they're not thinking that we'll come through there. So the German plan was to invade France by going through Belgium. And they calculated, they had timetables, they had it down to the day. They could get to Paris, conquer France, before the Russians would be ready. So, August 3rd, 1914, Germany declares war on France and invades Belgium. Germany did ask the Belgians for permission to march through their country. The Belgians, not surprisingly, said, no, we'd rather you not do that. So Germany invaded. Now, what's Britain going to do? That's the next question. The British had several reasons for getting involved. Years earlier, Britain had participated in a treaty that was committed to the protection of Belgian independence. And here you have Germany wanting to march through Belgium. And Britain had also promised to defend France if it ever got attacked by Germany. So Britain declared war too. And I don't know if you've been keeping track of the dates, but basically every day somebody new declares war. It's happened over the course of 4 days. So there's the British declaration of war, August 4th, 1914. And so in the space of 6 weeks, you find yourself with the countries in green lined up against the countries in yellow on that map. Most everybody in Europe, with just a few exceptions, the countries in purple, most everybody's at war. The British Foreign Minister, Sir Edward Grey, told one of his colleagues as all this was happening, the lamps are going out all over Europe. We will not see them lit again in our lifetime. Because he knew the world was going to change because of this. So now one thing about that alignment that might not, if you have a really good memory from my earlier map, Italy is fighting on the side of Britain and France. Italy was supposed to be part of the alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but the British and the French lured them onto their side by offering to help them get territory at the expense of Austria. And Italy was sort of hoping to get some of the Adriatic coast, the part that's yellow there on the map. So the Italians made a strategic move to switch sides. At the same time, the Bulgarians and the Ottoman Empire decide to jump in because they're hoping to get territory at the expense of Russia. That helps explain why some of the other countries show up in the war as well. On that particular map, Belgium is shown as being neutral, but in fact they were occupied by the Germans throughout the course of the war. So, a few points. There hadn't been a big war in Europe in 100 years. Not since the British, the Prussians, and the Russians defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815 had there been a big European war. Been a few little ones like the Crimean War, but nobody'd seen a big war in Europe for 100 years. And so people on both sides naively assumed this is going to be quick, we're going to win, it's easy, it's going to be easy. The military leaders on both sides promised that all the troops would be home by Christmas. Because they hadn't seen a big war. If they had been thinking, what big war has happened in the last 100 years that might be an example, the American Civil War could have popped to mind. Because when you have two big countries with industrial power fighting each other, now that technology has gotten more and more lethal, you could have something as bloody as the American Civil War. But they weren't thinking about that at all. So in every country, you have big crowds of people cheering as the troops head off to the front. The von Schlieffen plan almost worked. The Germans went sailing through Belgium. There are the red lines on that map. They could see Paris on the horizon. They got so close in September and October of 1914. They almost got there. It almost worked, but it didn't. The French and the British managed to slow them down and start pushing them back. And the Germans retreated a bit and then dug a line. It's that sort of orange line running from northwest down to the Swiss border. Ended up, when winter rolled in 1914, the Germans started digging trenches to defend themselves. The British and the French started digging trenches. By the end of the year, there was one trench running 500 miles from Switzerland to the Belgian coast. For the next 3 years, the front barely moved. Now, it is really hard to imagine how terrifying this war would have been and what it would have been like to be one of the soldiers. First of all, okay, so trenches. You couldn't dig more than about 2 feet below the surface in Belgium without hitting water. So the trenches were basically mud. And you're living in mud all the time. You're living with raw sewage everywhere, because it's very hard to keep things clean. You're living with rats everywhere. On this wonderful photo, on the lower left there, that is a heroic British terrier. And those are all the rats that particular terrier has killed recently. They're all on display. Can you see the little guy? Someone's holding him. He's very proud. So just being in the trenches on a daily basis must have been horrific. But of course, it wasn't just being in a trench. The artillery bombardments, as each side tried to pulverize the other side's trenches before attacking, the bombardments went on for hours. Can you imagine being in the center of a 4th of July fireworks that goes on for 3 or 4 hours? Constantly. The shells killed more people than any other weapon in this war. Shells also created something that the generals and the doctors had never seen before, something we all now think of as shell shock. Soldiers had not been subjected to this kind of treatment ever before. And it caused psychological damage that no one was prepared for, and at the time, the generals and the doctors thought was just cowardice. But it was, in fact, the soldiers were just, imagine what that experience would be. I don't know if you've been there anytime recently, but northern France and Belgium is beautiful farm country. But that's what it ended up looking like. It was a barren wasteland running from hundreds of miles. As usual, technology made it easier to kill people. Machine guns were developed and perfected in this period. The machine gun could fire 10 bullets a second. That's just one gun. You have a whole row of those guns firing 10 bullets per second, and then you imagine you're on the other side and your officers are telling you, attack! You run across no man's land with those people aimed at you. It's hard to imagine. The machine gun was a huge defense for the people in a trench waiting for the other side to come along. Another new weapon was the airplane. At first, they just used planes for reconnaissance. Then they discovered, hey, you can drop bombs from a plane. And then they started installing little machine guns on the plane, so you could actually shoot at guys on the ground. And the new form of warfare, the aerial combat. That is the Red Baron. That's Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron there, who shot down 80 other planes before he finally got shot down. When he was shot down in 1918, the British honored him with a full military funeral because they respected him that much. And then technology also invented the poison gas. Chlorine gas, phosphine, and then sulfur mustard. which killed and injured thousands of people. They never used it as much as they could have, basically because it was impossible to control. You know, you fire the shell, but then depending on what the wind's doing, the wind can blow it all back in your face. And imagine trying to, run around fighting people when you're also wearing really heavy gas masks. It's like, I find it really hard to imagine. That painting on the bottom, I don't know if, that's a painting by John Singer Sargent of soldiers blinded by gas wandering through the battlefield. I had never seen that before until I found it on the internet. Despite all these weapons and the ability to kill people so easily, the generals were constantly ordering people over the top across no man's land, trying to break through the other side. And so from the fall of 1914 into 1918, the front hardly moves, but what does happen is that lots and lots of people get killed. The result of all this was a staggering number of dead people. There were bodies everywhere. It was impossible to keep up with the burials. People would get bodies would get blown up, and then months later, the bodies would turn up when more explosions came along. For comparison, the worst battle of the American Civil War in terms of casualties was Gettysburg. Over the course of 3 days at Gettysburg, a total of 50,000 men were killed or wounded on both sides. 50,000, and that was bad. The Battle of the Somme was a river in northern France. The Battle of the Somme lasted 4 months in 1916 and cost 1 million men killed or wounded in just one string of 4 months on one river. Battle of Verdun lasted most of 1916, killed 800,000 people, killed or wounded. The French have a mass grave near Verdun with an estimated 150,000 bodies in it, many of whom they couldn't identify, of course. Okay, so this is slaughter on an unprecedented scale and a shock to the Europeans who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization. What's America going to do when all this is happening? The president at the time was Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat. Wilson had quite a distinguished career. He had been even people in academia can become politicians. Wilson had been a political scientist. He had been the president of Princeton University. Then he was governor of New Jersey. And in 1912, he managed to get elected president because the Republicans were split. In this period, the Democrats were still the minority party. But in 1912, you had William Howard Taft, the president. You had Theodore Roosevelt deciding to come out of retirement and challenge Taft for the nomination, and then run as a third-party candidate. So with three candidates in the field, Wilson was able to win. He's a political scientist and a scholar of American government. And he told one of his friends that given his background, it would certainly be an irony of fate if his administration was forced to deal with foreign affairs. Now, for his first term, he was able to focus on domestic affairs, and he was a very successful president in his first term. He supervised the passage of the law that creating the Federal Reserve System, creating the Federal Trade Commission, lowering the tariff, and creating the passage of the first income tax. He had quite an agenda for Congress, and he got everything he wanted in his first term through Congress. But then fate stepped in with foreign affairs. So, what's the initial American response to the war? The U.S. ambassador in London cabled to Wilson, "I thank God for the Atlantic Ocean." And Wilson said to an aide, "We have to be neutral because otherwise our mixed populations would wage war on each other." A couple weeks after the war started, Wilson issued a statement of neutrality. And he said, and this is true, the people of the United States are drawn from many nations, chiefly from the nations that are now at war. Some will wish one nation, some will favor another. Divisions among us would be fatal to our peace of mind and would stand in the way of the performance of our duty as the one great nation at peace. The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. I mean, think about it. At the time, I think German Americans may well have been the largest ethnic group within the country, but I mean, other than all the people of British ancestry. You had a lot of people of Irish ancestry who might well have been hoping that Britain would lose and that Ireland would become independent. So, you had various people cheering for different sides in this war, and Wilson was wise to try to keep us out of it. But it wasn't easy to stay neutral. One of Britain's advantages was its navy, and so the British imposed a naval blockade on shipments going to Germany. Germany had submarines, so Germany decided to use its submarines to try to sink ships that were sending supplies to Britain. One of the most famous of the ships that were sunk was the liner, the Lusitania. In May 1915, a German submarine sank the Lusitania off the Irish coast. 1,200 people were killed, including 100 Americans. It was considered, it was widely denounced as a terrible attack on a passenger ship, but it's worth pointing out that the Lusitania was not entirely neutral. It was delivering 4 million rounds of ammunition to Great Britain. So there were war supplies on that ship too, along with all the passengers, which is not a justification, but just sort of it helps put some context to what the stakes were, and the Germans felt they had to sink ships like that because they were part of the effort to supply Great Britain with what it needed. The Germans off and on sank ships over the next year, and finally, after a German sub sank a passenger ferry that was crossing the English Channel, Wilson sent Germany an ultimatum, and the Germans stopped the submarines for the time being. Wilson wanted to be neutral, but the United States economy was most definitely not neutral. Here's some figures to try to explain. The war was a huge economic opportunity for American business. Britain and France needed a lot of supplies to fight the war. American industry was really happy to provide those supplies. So American trade with England and France went from 750 million to 2.7 billion, while our trade with Germany basically shrank to nothing. We were already generating a pretty good trade surplus, but look, it went from less than 500 million to 3.3 billion. Big, really good times for American industry. And to help out, American banks like JP Morgan loaned Britain and France over $2 billion. Point being, the United States had a huge economic incentive in Britain and France winning the war. As the war continues and an election is coming, Wilson felt the need to try to show that we were prepared to defend ourselves if we had to. So he launched a preparedness campaign, and Congress approved the largest military budget to date, plans to double the size of the Army, to greatly expand the National Guard, plans to build the world's largest Navy and to build lots of new merchant ships, tax increase to pay for it all. Every 4 years we have an election. So in 1916, Wilson is campaigning partly on this idea that we're prepared if we need to be, but he also campaigned on this slogan, "He kept us out of war." So in 1916, it's interesting to say Wilson barely was reelected. Like I said, the Republicans were the majority party, and now that they only had one candidate, and that was Charles Evans Hughes, who had been a governor of New York and was actually on the Supreme Court at the time. Hughes was a liberal Republican with a lot of political power, he had a good reputation, and Wilson only won the election because he squeaked through California by a few thousand votes. Now, keeping out of the war became harder as soon as the election was over and Wilson was sworn in for the second time. And that's because in 1917, the Germans decided to go for broke. They came to the conclusion that if they, with a big offensive, they hoped they could defeat the British and the French before America could ever actually get involved. To do that, they decided to resume their submarine warfare. So on February 1st, Germany turns the subs loose again, the U-boats. 2 days later, Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Germany. But Wilson wasn't prepared to go to war yet. He was getting pushed, and events were pushing him in that direction, but it's not something he wanted to do. So the British decided to help out a little bit. The British sent Wilson a copy of what became known as the Zimmermann telegram. That's the actual telegram on the slide. So the telegram was a telegram from the German foreign minister, whose last name was Zimmermann, to the German ambassador in Mexico. And it was intercepted and decoded by the British. And in that telegram, Zimmermann is suggesting that the German ambassador in Mexico try to enlist Mexico on the German side, so that with promises that Germany would help Mexico attack the United States and recover Texas and California if we got involved in the war. So the British, when they saw that, thought this is guaranteed to help inflame American opinion. And so they happily sent it to Wilson, who published it. And American public opinion was outraged that the Germans would be meddling with the Mexicans. There's a political cartoon of a German general with one of those funny pointed helmets they used to wear, whispering in the ear of a stereotypical Mexican-looking person in a sombrero. Somewhat racist, that cartoon, but it is what it is. The Germans continued sinking American merchant ships, and so Wilson finally concluded he had no choice. He had to ask for war. So on April 2nd, 1914, Wilson goes to Congress. And the speech he gave is one of the most effective, one of the most powerful speeches ever in American history. It was, and what he said is, the German submarine warfare is warfare against all of mankind. What can America do? Our object is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world against selfish and autocratic power. We have no quarrel with the German people. We have no feeling toward them but one of sympathy and friendship. It wasn't their idea, but their government's idea to start the war. And here's the key part. The world must be made safe for democracy. Congress goes crazy, politicians on both sides cheering wildly at that point. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We are just one of the champions of the rights of mankind. And then it is a fearful thing. This is still Wilson to Congress. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, with civilization itself in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things that we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for the universal dominion of right by a concert of free people, so that we can bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free. Huge ovation, huge ovation. The idea, this is America's special mission at its most idealistic and touching in a way, that we are in a position to save the world from itself. We can save democracy from people who are trying to oppress it, like the German Empire. We have the ability to do that. We have the ability to save the world. It's wonderful if that were true, right? It sounds like a really cool thing. On his way back to the White House, Wilson said to his press secretary, my message today was a message of death for our young men. How strange it seems to applaud that. And he was right. 2 days later, on what happened to be Good Friday in the Christian calendar, the United States Congress declared war. The vote was 82-6 in the Senate and 373-50 in the House. One of the votes against in the House was cast by Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress. She came from Montana. She was a lifelong pacifist. She voted against the war, and in her very first speech to the House of Representatives, she said, "I want to stand by my country, but I cannot vote for war." The crowd cheered her. Her colleagues on the, I'm sorry, I don't know why I'm upset. Her colleagues on the floor of the House cheered her, but the voters in Montana did not reelect her the next time around, in any event. By a total coincidence, she was back in Congress in 1941 at Pearl Harbor and voted against World War II as well. She was the only person to vote against World War II, and she said, "I know we have to do it, but I cannot vote for war." She was campaigning against the Vietnam War when she was 80-something, so quite a heroic lady. In any event, okay, now we're in the war. We need an army. At the time we got into the war, the U.S. Army was ranked number 17 in the world. We had an army the same size as Chile, and there were only 24,000 men with enough equipment that you could actually even send to France. Which is no wonder the Germans didn't take us seriously. Like, you know, the American army isn't ready to do anything and won't be ready for a long time. That was their assumption. So here are some of the recruiting posters. It's one of the most famous uses of Uncle Sam. I mean, you've all seen that face, but it was used initially to try to get people to volunteer for the war in 1917. I like the posters. I don't know if you can read them, but the posters for the Navy on the right side of the slide. One of them, the sailor is saying to somebody, "Don't just read American history, make it." Like, you know, join the Navy. And then the other one is a woman saying, "Boy, I wish I were a man, I could join the Navy." I don't know whether that poster worked, but... And actually, these posters didn't quite work well enough because there weren't enough volunteers, and so Congress had to create a draft. The Selective Service Act applied to every man aged 21 to 30, and they drafted 3 million men over the next 18 months. Beside raising an army, they had to raise a lot of money. Big increase in the income tax. The top rate went to 63%. And a heavy effort to try to get Americans to buy war bonds, which is basically you loaning money to the government so it can fight, and then you're getting paid back after the war. So lots of Liberty Loan bond drives. I put up a couple of the posters. 11 million Americans bought a total of $21 billion worth of war bonds. I mean, those campaigns were very successful. One of the main themes that you find in the recruiting and in the war bonds is treating the Germans as animals. Here are some of those posters. "Destroy this mad brute, enlist," that one on the left. You got to think the person either that person was anticipating King Kong or the people who devised the King Kong movie had seen that poster. But I mean, look at that. That's the gorilla and Fay Wray right there. The Committee on Public Information sponsored propaganda films. I've got an advertisement for one of them there. "The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin." Vilifying our enemies, making them appear less than human. I mean, that's a natural human motive, a thing people do in wartime, and it was certainly done effectively during World War I. Another thing that was done during World War I was to try to prevent people from complaining or criticizing the war effort. The post office was given the power to monitor newspapers and to refuse to deliver things that were considered anti-loyal or anti-war. The Espionage Act, you could go to jail for up to 20 years for interfering with the draft or publishing disloyal statements. You could go to jail. The Sedition Act, you could go to jail for up to 20 years for interfering with the sale of war bonds or even just saying disloyal and abusive things about the government. The Supreme Court said those were fine. The government arrested nearly 2,000 people, including the nation's most famous socialist, Eugene Debs, who spent the rest of the war in jail. In June 1917, the very first of American troops got to France. They were commanded by General John Pershing, nicknamed Black Jack. But for the rest of 1917, there weren't many American troops. They weren't really ready to fight, and so they didn't make a whole lot of a contribution. Now, so we'll come back to that. In January 1918, Wilson announces what American war aims are, what our objectives are. And there were 14 of them, and they became known as the 14 points. One of his motives for releasing the 14 points was to try to counter the Russian Revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks took power in Russia in November 1917, and their call was that the peoples of the world don't have any grievance against each other. They should all just end the war and go home. And the Bolshevik appeal was really quite persuasive to a lot of people in Europe who were tired of the fight. So to try to motivate people to continue fighting because there were things worth fighting for, Wilson released the 14 points. And again, this is like an elaboration of what I mentioned with his speech to Congress. A policy that is good for America, but ultimately is good for all the peoples of the world. That's how Wilson saw it, and he most genuinely believed it himself. So what were they? We'll quickly walk through them. Open covenants of peace. Basically, that means that when this war gets resolved, everyone's going to know what the peace terms are. There won't be any secret side deals. Freedom of navigation on the seas. The removal of economic barriers. Basically, he was urging the world to drop its tariff barriers so that people can just sell things to each other and not, on one level, that is like, the more people trade with each other, the more they're likely to get along. That was also, if like the British Empire drops its tariff barriers, American business can sell more to those people. So there was an economic value to removing tariff barriers and a more kind of political value. Reducing armaments, free and impartial adjustment of colonial claims, let Russia determine its own destiny, of course get the Germans out of Belgium, get the Germans out of France, and there were provinces in northeastern France that Germany had controlled for several decades. They should go back to France. A readjustment, that was a polite word for giving the Italians a little more land on the Austrian border. All those ethnic groups I showed you before in the Austria-Hungary should get a chance to determine their own futures. Same thing for all the ethnic groups in the Balkans and the various peoples of the Ottoman Empire. And we should have Poland again. We should create a new Poland, independent, with a chance to get out to the Baltic Sea. And then the last of the points, and the most important from Wilson's point of view, was an international organization to help keep the peace, which he called the League of Nations. These principles, this is becomes the basis of American foreign policy. Really, Wilson was ahead of his time. This is the American foreign policy during and after World War II. This is how we tried to restructure the world after World War II. And it's, as you can see, it's a combination of America's special destiny, a desire to help all the peoples of the world live in a more peaceful world. I mean, that's a good thing. But there's an element of, this will also be good for the American economy. It's a combination of motives. It's complicated stuff. But the idealism was very powerful, and a lot of people in Europe really were enthusiastic about Wilson's 14 points. Some of the European leaders were not so much enthusiastic. French Prime Minister Clemenceau, so George Clemenceau, one of the ultimate cynics in European history, Clemenceau said, "Monsieur Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why, God Almighty only had 10. So, by the summer and fall of 1918, Pershing had commanded more than 1 million American soldiers who were ready to fight, and there was another 1 million of them in France getting ready to go to the front. Pershing finally had quite a large army and joined with the British and the French armies. In the summer and fall of 1918, the Allies broke through the German lines. And I know those colors are a little hard to see on that map, but the green line is as far as the Germans got at the beginning of the war. The red and the purple and brown lines in the middle are sort of where the front waffled around during the war. And then with that offensive in 1918, the bright red line is how far the British, the French, and the Americans got. They were just about at the German border. They had pushed the Germans virtually out of France and Belgium. The German military could see, this is sort of like when you're in a chess match and you realize you're losing. You don't necessarily have to play it out to the bitter end to know that the way the pieces are lined up, you're going to lose. The German military saw that they were going to lose, that there were too many Americans. It seemed like an infinite number of them could keep crossing the Atlantic and getting ready to fight. So the German military asked for peace. They asked for an armistice. And on November 11th, 1918, delegation from Germany went into that railroad car in northern France, right near the border, and signed the armistice papers. The human cost of World War I is staggering. Now, 1.3 American men saw action, were in combat during the war. 117,000 were killed, 204,000 were wounded, which is obviously pretty serious. But look at the figures for the other European countries. Germany, Russia. The Germans, the Russians, the French, the Austro-Hungarians, the British, the Italians, they lost almost an entire generation of young men. I think in France the figure is something like 1/4 of the men in the 18 to 25 range were either killed or wounded. I mean, it was, it's a whole generation wiped out. And then on top of that, what we call unfairly the Spanish flu shows up just as the war is ending. The Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 to 1919 killed 50 million people worldwide, including 675,000 Americans. So on top of all this carnage, you have the influenza epidemic. Okay, so how do we try to put the pieces together of Europe after the armistice? Well, Wilson had been a very smart politician domestically during his first term, but he made some serious strategic mistakes when it came to the peace process. First of all, he decided to lead the American delegation himself. I mean, no one could do it better than him. He didn't bring any Republicans with him. The delegation consisted of him and a few flunkies who helped him out, but no leading Republicans who you could kind of try to draw into it and help take responsibility for what the treaty looked like. He excluded the Republicans from the process entirely. And he basically assumed that through the power of his eloquence and just the fact that he was right, he could persuade the other European leaders to do the right thing, to make peace on his terms. And it did not help that the French people, because the negotiations were at Versailles, it did not help that the French people treated him as as a savior. So you see the crowds lining the streets as the motorcade goes by. There's Wilson happily waving his hat to the French crowds. That's French President Raymond Poincaré, who does not look nearly as enthusiastic. He was just in the car for the ride, I guess. So Wilson really thought that he could control the peacemaking process. It didn't happen that way. The other people he had to deal with, there were dozens of countries who sent representatives to try to have a say in what the treaty looked like. The people who mattered were those four. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Wilson, of course, the French Prime Minister Clemenceau, who I mentioned before, the Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. They were the people who merely made the decisions. And Britain, France, and Italy had their very specific agenda. They wanted to grab Germany's colonies. They wanted to make Germany pay for the war. And they wanted to do their best to make sure that Germany could never wage war again. Wilson's agenda was the main thing he wanted was commitment to the League of Nations. And so he kept making concessions to the other people about their colonies, about making Germany pay for the war. He kept making concessions to secure agreement about the League of Nations, which frankly was something they could care less about. Clemenceau and Lloyd George, they didn't believe in it, they didn't think it was going to do much, but they were willing to play along with Wilson if they got the things that did matter to them. It took 6 months, but whoops, there we go. And that, I forgot to relabel the date on that slide. Good heavens, shame on me. That treaty was actually signed in June of 1919. Sorry about that. When they finally were handed the document, the German leaders were shocked. They thought they were negotiating on the basis of the 14 points, and instead they got shafted. They lost their colonies. They were ordered to sign a clause in which Germany was forced to say that it alone caused World War I. The War Guilt Clause. Germany alone was responsible, which for anybody who had been paying attention was nonsense, because lots of countries had some role in how that played out. It certainly wasn't just the Germans. And they were forced to sign, they were forced to agree to pay for the war, and initially they weren't even told how much they were going to have to pay. It took a couple of years before a committee finally told them to pay $12 billion. I'll get, when we talk about the origins of World War II, I'll come back to some other aspects of the treaty. But the treaty really was crushing for the Germans. There were a lot of Americans who did not like what the treaty looked like for a number of reasons. German Americans, and there were a lot of them, thought the treaty was way too unfair to Germany. There were many Italian Americans who thought Italy should have gotten a lot more land from Austria-Hungary. It got a little bit, but not nearly what some Italians wanted. There was all that talk in the 14 points about independence and liberation of people in colonies, and yet the treaty just said nothing about the Irish. And Ireland was treated as a colony by Great Britain. And there were a lot of Irish Americans who really thought the treaty was a disaster and a terrible missed opportunity, and that America had just sold out to the British yet again. And the fact that the treaty not only gave Britain and France Germany's colonies, but even gave them new colonies in the Middle East under the label of mandates. There were a lot of progressives in America who thought this was a terrible sellout to European imperialism. So there were a lot of people who weren't pleased with how the treaty actually came out. When Wilson presented the treaty to Congress, or particularly to the Senate, he once again invoked America's special mission. He said, "The stage is set, the destiny is disclosed. It has come about by no plan of our making, but by the hand of God. The hand of God has led us into this. We cannot turn back now. America shall show the way." Okay, it's again, America's special mission. The Republicans who controlled the Senate at the time were not at all impressed by that argument. And the leading Republican at the time was Senator Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts. There were many parts of the treaty he was skeptical about, but he was particularly concerned about what was called Article 10, which seemed to be a guarantee of all current borders, like that the League of Nations and the Assembly of World Countries would be committed to protecting all the borders that currently exist. And to Lodge, it sounded a lot like America would be committing to protect British and French colonies. And he wasn't particularly interested in doing that. So Lodge had reasons of principle that he opposed the treaty. He didn't want to be tied down. He didn't want anything to suggest that America had to get involved in a war because of some commitment from this treaty. He wanted America to maintain its freedom of action, which there was a certain logic to that. There was also an element of personality. Lodge absolutely hated Wilson. Lodge told Teddy Roosevelt was one of Lodge's close friends, and Lodge told Roosevelt at one point, "I never expected to hate anyone in politics with the hatred I feel toward Wilson." I mean, Wilson was a touch sanctimonious. He was a touch, God has told me what we need to do, and I am God's vessel, and this is what America needs to do, and you people should just get in line. There was a certain moral righteousness about Wilson that Lodge absolutely found offensive. In any event, so Lodge wants to make some changes to the treaty to protect some of the things he's worried about. Wilson says no changes at all, and Wilson goes on a public speaking campaign on behalf of the treaty. And so he's traveling the country. He goes on a 10,000-mile journey, speeches all over the country. The crowds are pretty sympathetic. It's going really well until September 1919 when he had a massive stroke. And what's amazing about this is Wilson was seriously incapacitated by that stroke. They whisked him back to Washington and hid him in the White House, and for the next year and a half, Wilson's wife and some of his closest advisors ran the country. Members of a couple of people from Congress from time to time would be allowed into the White House for brief meetings with Wilson that would be carefully orchestrated. But basically, Wilson was a shadow, a fragment of his former self. Other people were running the country, and the American public had no idea. I mean, you couldn't get away with that today. I don't think. I mean, you can have, no. You could have a lunatic running the country, but no, I didn't say that. I mean, the secrecy of it, I don't think you could have that secrecy today, right? I mean, he truly, it wasn't that he was completely impaired, but his brain was not nearly what it had been, and he couldn't speak very well, and they, propped him up and let a few people talk to him from time to time. It's amazing. In any event, the Senate had 2 votes on the treaty. First, just the treaty itself, and it didn't even get a majority, let alone the 2/3 it needed. And then later, with the treaty plus some of Lodge's, what he called reservations, that got over half, but it still didn't get enough. It didn't get the 2/3 it needed. So the treaty never happens in America. And after the treaty was defeated, for the most part, for the next 10 years, America does its best to pretend the rest of the world's not there. The United States did not join the League of Nations. The United States did not join the World Court. The main thing that Americans cared about from the rest of the world, you might say, was from Jerry Maguire, show me the money. Americans did care to make sure that Britain and France repaid all those war loans. In order to repay the loans from us, Britain and France needed Germany to make its reparation payments. In order to make its reparations payments, Germany needed loans from us. And so we participated in 2 international conferences which fixed what the German reparations level was going to be. And you basically have this bizarre circle in which the United States loans money to Germany, Germany pays the money to Britain and France pay the money to us to repay us for all those war contracts and the loans, and we're paying ourselves. And everybody's happy, I guess. One other aspect of as part of the sort of backlash against the war was a part of the desire to just have the rest of the world leave us alone was a Republican campaign to control immigration. If you remember, the 2 decades before World War I were the peak of immigration from Europe, mostly Central Europe, Russians, Poles, Southern Europe, Greeks, Italians, millions of Jews escaping the pogroms in Russia and Poland. You can think of the pictures of folks going through Ellis Island, the millions of immigrants right before the war. White middle-class Protestants, that had made them nervous, and in the 1920s, those white middle-class Protestant Republicans who controlled Congress changed the rules and basically pulled up the drawbridge. In 1924, immigration was capped at 150,000 people per year. In the peak year of 1907, 1.3 million people came here. And that was just 1 year. Every year before the World War I, you had nearly 1 million or more than 1 million immigrants coming through Ellis Island. This pretty much ends that. Not only does it set an annual cap, but the cap was calculated per country, and it was calculated based on the percentage of people from that country living here back in 1890, which is back before the big increase in immigration from Poland and Russia and Southern Europe. They played with the quotas in order to favor people coming from like Great Britain or Canada, or the more Irish, and excluding the peoples from Central and Southern Europe. But at least there was a quota for those people. There was a total exclusion of people from Japan, and there was a provision in that law that Asian folks cannot become citizens of the United States. The racism against the Asians was profound at the time. It's easy to forget in some respects, but it was quite fierce. We pulled up the drawbridge. We weren't going to let people who needed to escape the poverty and difficult conditions in Europe or Asia come here any longer. Instead, Americans spent the 20s, the roaring 20s. So I just thought I'd throw up a few photos there. Most Americans spent the 20s obsessed with things like prohibition. There's a slide in the center there of people pouring booze down a drain. Prohibition, talking movies. There's Al Jolson and the jazz singer. And personalities of the 20s like Babe Ruth, President Calvin Coolidge, Al Capone, or Charles Lindbergh, who flew the Atlantic, I think it was 1927. But basically, Americans in the 1920s, for the most part, said to the rest of the world, leave us alone. We're quite happy over here. We don't need you. We still do want you to pay back those loans. There was that part. But otherwise, it was basically to the rest of the world, leave us alone. As we'll find out when we have our next session, that it became a lot harder to say that to the rest of the world. They just leave us alone. We don't care what happens to you. It became a lot harder to stick with that as the 1930s go along. And Japan expands, and Hitler expands, and Mussolini expands, and it becomes a lot harder to say we don't care what happens over there. And that'll be the topic for Friday when Franklin Roosevelt, as the president, tried to educate Americans that it actually did matter to us. We actually were affected by what happened in other parts of the world. But that's a story for Friday. So next class Friday at 1, not 2. And otherwise, thank you all for being here.